Do you know what time it is? It's supernatural story time. And if you're easily scared, and even if you're not, there's only one thing left to do. Just turn off the lights, because these are stories that you listen to only in the dark.
Campfire Stories, Volume 7, Story Number 1. Newly married, my husband was excited to be taking me to visit and meet his grandparents. All I knew about them and the area in which they lived was that it was back in what was referred to as a holler, and that they continued to live without many modern-day conveniences. They had electricity, but I found this to be their only convenience. No running water, nothing else that pertained to modern day. They continued to collect water needed from a natural mountain stream at the end of the holler. I found this intriguing considering it was 1985. We were invited to stay the night. I needed to relieve myself before turning in for the night, and my husband escorted me to the outhouse. He had warned me in advance to not be frightened. When asked what he meant by that, he simply replied again that I should not be too concerned with anything I may experience. We headed back to the house with me in awe of what my husband could have been referring to. At approximately 10 p.m., I was lying on the bed when I heard what sounded like a vehicle trying to make its way up the drive. I sat up, looked out the window, and even saw the headlights. I walked into the dining area where my husband's grandfather sat and told him that company was coming. He told me that there was no one coming. I repeated myself, and again he told me that no one was coming. I told him that I heard the car, saw the headlights, and even heard a door shutting. He then told me that it happens often, that one will hear a vehicle, see the headlights, and even hear the vehicle door shutting, but that no one would be there. I literally felt the hair on my arm stand up, and chills went down my spine. Scared to death, I went into the room where my husband was lying and told him what I had experienced. He smiled and told me once again that he warned me not to be frightened. No one in the family could ever explain the experience. No one knew why or what the reason was for such a phenomena. That was many, many years ago, and I've carried it with me always. I have never forgotten the experience, and just last summer my husband and I revisited the area. His grandparents both passed away in the early 90s. The house has fallen to ruin, and the area itself is now blocked from allowing visitors. I wonder, though, if one particular vehicle has been blocked. Story number 2. The weekend following the assassination of President John F. Kennedy by his assassin Lee Harvey Oswald, two of my neighborhood friends and I walked off across the railroad tracks from the old C&O depot at 53rd Street and Lancaster Avenue. We were on our way up the side of the mountain across from the depot to hunt for Civil War artifacts that were common in that area. Many West Virginians are unaware that Robert E. Lee's 1st Confederate Command was the protection of the Kanawha Valley from the west of Charleston to Gauley Bridge, where the New River and the Kanawha meet at the falls. Lee had placed artillery on as many of the mountain tops on both sides of the Kanawha River as he had available. They were manned by the Kanawha riflemen and other volunteers. Lee was a former colonel in the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers and had set up as formidable defenses as he had men to maintain it. His failure to march on the Yankees marching in from Ohio had his men disheartened to the point where he had actually been nicknamed Granny Lee. So with the help of our fathers, we boys knew just about every fort on top of the hill on our side of the river. My father told us that if we went pretty much straight up the hill behind the depot, we'd find an old tunnel that had started out as a coal mine until saltpeter had been located there. Saltpeter is a main component of gunpowder, and tracks had been laid out in the tunnel so mules could haul it out in boxes. Dad told us that there were other Civil War artifacts to be had there, including musket balls and even cannonballs could be found. The three of us made our way up the hill, stopping occasionally to swing on a grapevine or two, and before very long, about 2/3 of the way up, a hole in the side of the hill was found. It wasn't very deep into the mountain, maybe 30 or 40 feet or so, and the light from the winter sun shone fairly deep into the hole. We'd also swiped a few candles and so armed made our way inside. What I remember most about that late afternoon was how cold it was inside the tunnel. Indeed, there was some rusty tracks inside, but they no longer went the entire length of the tunnel. We also found a pick and a couple of tongs, a rusted shovel, and a couple of cases worth of empty Wild Irish Rose wine bottles. There was a whole lot of dirt piled up on either side of the tunnel, so we went to work sifting through it, hoping to find Confederate buttons, old lead round ball bullets, and especially one of those cannonballs my dad said were up there. When you're a kid on a mission, you lose track of time, and we did. Before too long, it was dark and our candles wouldn't stay lit because of a wind that kept blowing them out. We had stayed until true dark, and we were becoming more and more certain there were ghosts in the tunnel. We decided to lock hands and stretch out to hold onto a wall and walk a short distance out. The problem was that the tunnel that we thought was only about 30 feet deep seemed miles long on our journey out. We got scared and one of the boys, my wimpy cousin, or was it me? Nah, started crying and yelling for help. Our imaginations ran wild and soon we could hear voices in the tunnel. When we yelled out to them to help us, all we heard was laughter and what was worse, no one answered our cries for help. We rounded a slight bend in the tunnel, one none of us could remember seeing, going in, and wonder of wonders, there was a lighted oil lamp burning on the wall. It wasn't the type of kerosene lamp we were used to seeing either. It was square, with a large front glass and somewhat square in shape. There was a reflector behind it. About 10 feet behind the lamp was the opening to the tunnel, and we took off for it without even thinking. We flew down the side of that hill, ripping through blackberry and other briar patches, falling and slipping all the way down. The street lights were on below us, so we had no trouble finding our way down. I fell and hurt my ankle, and the other two guys kept on running, leaving me behind to fend for myself. After sitting still for a minute, I got up, turned around, could just make out the dim light of the lamp above me. I heard, once again, the laughter from inside the tunnel. And the light? Where had the light come from? So far as I know, none of us ever went back to that tunnel. Next story. For 5 years, I worked 3 to 11 in the housekeeping department at Weirton Medical Center in Weirton, West Virginia. There were several ghosts in that building, and I have a few short tales here. My ghost tales are amusing now, but weren't at the time. My job at WMC was as a floor tech. That is, I cleaned and buffed floors and cleaned carpets. One evening, I was sent up to do a room on the 5th floor in cardiac care. As I went about my job mopping the floor in preparation for buffing, I noticed a heart monitor in the corner that was beeping. That monitor wasn't hooked up, and if anyone out there knows what I mean, when a heart monitor is left unattended, it will beep, but only as a signal that it's been left on. This monitor, however, was beeping in a normal rhythm. Beep, 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 beep. As I worked, it kind of started to give me the creeps. I went out to the nurse's station and told a nurse about it, and how it was weirding me out. She only smiled and came in to remove the monitor. She explained then that heart monitors are not normally left unattended in that particular room. It seemed that they have an odd tendency to come on by themselves, even if unplugged. Needless to say, that particular room's floor got only a cursory job that night. Another experience I had was in the cardiac catheterization lab. Now, the cath lab area used to be part of the larger surgery area, but some remodeling was done several years ago and it was given its own smaller suite of rooms. I went down one evening to do the cath lab floor and found the area locked up. Everyone had gone home for the night. No problem, I had a key. I went in, started moving stuff around and mopping as I usually did. I noticed some dust in a corner behind a heavy shelf and got a vacuum cleaner with attachments to suck it out. As I was bent over trying to get at the dust, out of the corner of my eye I noticed something that resembled a human form moving behind me. I stood up and looked around, thinking a nurse or doctor had come in. There were always emergency catheterizations being done, and if that were the case, I'd have to leave. No one was visible. However, I even shut off the vacuum and called out, but no one answered, so I went back to work. A few seconds later, another glimpse out of the corner of my eye. This time I turned fast enough and saw one of the bed tables move. Just a bit. I thought little of it, though. The tables were on wheels and would often shift when moved around, as I had done with them. Several minutes went by, and as I went out about mopping the back of the room, I bent over to move a chair. At that moment, something slapped me hard, right on the backside. I turned, but of course, once again, saw no one. I knew that there was supposedly a ghost in the surgery area, often seen by the nursing staff there and by one of my fellow housekeepers, the woman who cleaned the operating rooms every night. She was so used to the spirit, however, that she had even claimed to have regularly spoken with her, if that can be believed. The ghost was supposedly playful, a younger woman in a pink gown, and she appeared most often in ORs 5 and 6 for some reason. She could often be seen walking alone in the core area, the large surgical supply room which opens into all the operating rooms. I think that since the cath lab was once part of surgery, the good lady considered it part of her domain as well. Perhaps I irritated her a little for not paying enough attention to her antics. I also had another little run-in with the OR ghost myself. On another night, I had volunteered to work a double to cover for the guy who usually worked 11 to 7 as a housekeeper. At about 2 a.m., I got called to clean up OR 6 after an emergency surgery. Great. OR 6, one of the haunted ones, at 2 a.m. I knew the whole area would be empty by the time I got there, and it was. I got the housekeeping cart set up and went to the open door. They had graciously left the light on for me. The floor was spattered here and there with splotches of congealed blood, and various disposable items used in surgery were left lying around. I, of course, had to wipe everything down and thoroughly mop the floor with disinfectant. I went into the core, just outside the OR, and switched on the stereo, which I blared. I tuned it to an oldie station and started singing loudly along. My eyes kept wandering to the small observation window to the right, where the housekeeper I mentioned earlier, who usually cleaned in the OR, often saw the woman's face staring at her. Thankfully I saw nothing, playful ghost or not. I probably would have ended up cleaning my underwear out as well if I'd seen her. I finished up and put everything away, then went back into the core to turn off the stereo and turn off the lights. I lowered the volume and switched off the stereo, watching as the power light went out. I then hit the lights, plunging the whole area into darkness. The only light came from a dim light way up at the corner of the hall outside OR 6. I walked into the OR and suddenly, as I reached the middle of the room, the strains of Louie Louie thundered out of the speakers and into the darkness that surrounded me. The stereo had come back on by itself, louder even than I'd had it. That meant that I had to stand there in the dark, waiting for my eyes to adjust, then head back into the core and turn it off again. I swallowed hard and did this, then tailed out of the OR, my feet barely touching the floor, hoping there'd be no more ORs until the next shift came on at 7. There weren't. I wasn't the only one to have stereo trouble in the OR. As I told my tale the next day at work, 2 other female co-workers volunteered their story. A similar incident had occurred to them as they finished up in the surgery area late on Saturday evening. They were preparing to leave the area and were all the way up in front, out by the doors to the main hall, when the stereo came back on. They called their supervisor, who refused to come to investigate the incident, and shut it off. "There are 2 of you," he said, and hurriedly hung up. There were other restless spirits there too. Another housekeeper friend had to go up to site to clean a room. When she arrived and started cleaning, the nurse at the desk called her out. "Look here," he said, pointing at the television monitor. "There are cameras in each room, on 24/7, occupied or not." There on the monitor was a sheer cloud hovering over the table she'd been cleaning. They rose and went back to look in the room, but of course saw nothing, except that several of the bottles she'd brought with her had been moved. The guy said that they often had trouble with patients in this room, seeing odd things or hearing voices. But then, this was a psych ward. Such stories were usually dismissed. Maybe the patients aren't so crazy after all. Other odd things at the hospital. The whistler was a guy in work boots, jeans, and a flannel shirt that hung out in the laundry. We often speculated that maybe he was an employee of the old city dump, on which the hospital now sits. He didn't come around often and was usually heralded by a faint whistling. There was a voice in the morgue that was actually recorded once on a security guard's tape recorder. Over the whispery sound of the vents and faint machinery of the boiler room down the hall, a voice could be heard saying, "Help!" several times. I heard that tape myself. Very, very creepy. It was no fake. Believe me, either the guy was an actor of the caliber of Laurence Olivier, or he was really freaked out by it too. After that, he refused to go in the morgue alone and eventually quit. And those are some of my adventures as a floor tech. Next story. I grew up in Ravenswood, West Virginia. My parents were the proprietors of the local Washington Motel. As a result, I practically grew up there, as did my older sister and brother. There were large living quarters in the main office, which included 2 bedrooms, a second kitchen, and a bathroom on the second floor. As kids, we often slept and played up there. Looking back now, we can all recall many times when doors would suddenly slam or creepy sensations would overcome us. Even Mom told us of ghostly music that seemed to emanate from the walls at night. But we never thought much about it until we all got older and began to experience what I'm about to tell you. In 1988, when my sister got married, the upper portion of the office was completely renovated and turned into a private apartment for her and her new husband. Although they were then able to access it via a private entry out front, it was also still accessible by way of the 14 stairs inside the office. Often when I or my mother and father needed to speak with my sister or brother-in-law, we would simply stand at the foot of those stairs and call for them until they came and opened the door at the top to answer. By this time in the late 80s, business had become quite slow at the motel, so we didn't stay open 24/7 as we had years earlier, when local plant business was booming and the town was thriving. By now it was nothing out of the ordinary for Mom and Dad to close up early in the evening and retreat to our family home across town. This is precisely what they had been doing one evening that same year when Julie and Tom were enjoying a quiet night in the apartment watching TV. Julie was on the phone when she heard Mom calling for her from the bottom of the stairs, just like always. "Julie, Julie," she called. "Jules," said Tom, "get off the phone. Your mom is calling for you." At this point, Julie ended her conversation and headed for the door to see what Mom wanted. She opened the door and was shocked to see no one there. All she saw, in fact, was darkness, and upon further investigation, it was obvious that the office had been closed for the night. She and Tom were both confused, as each of them had heard my mother's voice calling out to her as clear as day. Julie immediately picked up the phone and called our house, only to find out we had locked up the office and left several hours earlier. Strange indeed, as were other things that frequently went on inside the newlyweds' nest. For example, when their brand new heating and cooling system failed, and the cause was found to be a blue blanket stuffed inside. Who had placed it there? No one knows. And occasionally a doorknob would rattle, a door slam shut, or an object fly off a wall. Many nights when Tom worked the night shift as a police officer, I would spend the night there with Julie. We were awake most of the night talking and laughing, often hearing the same eerie music Mom had spoken of so many times before. It was creepy, but never particularly scary. As time went on, they pretty well learned to live with their mischievous house guest, as did we all. In fact, we all affectionately began referring to it as George, since it was, after all, the Washington Motel. It didn't seem to mind, and any time its antics got a little out of hand, all we had to do was say, "That's enough, George," and things would settle down. Fast forward 8 years to 1996. By this time, Tom and Julie had moved out, as had several other renters. I was dating a young man named Garen at the time, and we had just returned from a concert late one night when he had the pleasure of being introduced to our resident ghost. At the time, the apartment was vacant, and on this particular night, Mom and Dad had closed up hours prior to our return. Garen went to use a restroom which is located at the foot of the inner staircase. Upon his return, he asked me if the apartment had recently been rented again. He was surprised when I said no, and went on to say that he was certain he had heard someone walking around up there while he was in the bathroom. Perhaps, he said, he should go up there and have a look around. I told him not to bother, that it was probably just George. Naturally, he asked me, "Who is George?" When I told him George was our resident spook, he replied with several choice curse words and told me I was crazy. It was at precisely that moment when George decided to make his presence known. I will never, ever forget the look on poor Garen's face as we both stood there and listened to the footsteps that slowly descended the stairs. I counted them, 14 exactly. Garen's eyes were as wide as saucers, but I thought they would pop out of his head completely when the footsteps continued onto the linoleum floor inside the downstairs kitchen. He immediately ran in there and flipped on the lights. Sure he would find an intruder. He didn't, of course. And from that point on, he stopped doubting any of my stories about George, or any other weird stories for that matter. George's antics continued on, even after Garen and I got married, and moved into the apartment ourselves. There we were, lazing in bed early one Sunday morning, when a familiar voice called up the stairs once again. "Linda! Garen!" Mom called. Garen and I both looked at each other in puzzlement, wondering what in the world Mom would be doing in the office this early on a Sunday morning, when any other week she would be relaxing at the house with a cup of coffee before going to church. I dragged myself out of bed to go to the door and see what she needed. Guess what? There was nothing, nobody, just silence in a closed office. I just snickered and shook my head, knowing that George was once again up to his old tricks. Tricks continued on for as long as we lived in the apartment. After we moved out, Dad rented the apartment several different times, but if anything was going on, we never heard anything about it. When Dad passed away in 2000, keeping the business became too much of a burden on my mother, and our family business was sold in 2005. These days, it operates not as a motel, but as more of an apartment complex. We all drive by it on a regular basis, and it saddens us to see the disrepair into which it has fallen. The apartment remains occupied almost constantly, but we have no contact with the new owners and are not aware of whether or not strange occurrences continue there. We all, however, have our own memories, and we know what we experience. George was a very playful and benevolent presence in that apartment, and as long as we respected his presence and his space, he never scared us or posed what we thought to be a threat to anyone. I've always been curious as to the history of the building and the property, but somehow it seemed like a violation of that trust to poke into it too far. As it is, we have all just done with George what we did with every other motel guest: welcomed him and given him a warm place to stay. Next story. I spent a few years working in a home for those with developmental disabilities. People familiar with Wheeling will know the house. It's on GCNP Road, just past the Troy Corporation on the left side of the road. The side of the house was built on used to be an old farmhouse. At some point in time, a plague wiped out much of the farm's family. The family was buried on the property just yards from what is now GCNP Road. There are several grave markers remaining on the property, with a handful of them set in a circle. The circle contains the graves of children. Just slightly up the hill from the circle of graves sits a few that have sunken into the ground, leaving rectangular holes in the earth. One grave marker just 2 feet from where the new home built its shed. The new home does not have a basement, and it's rumored to be because instead of paying to move the graves, they simply moved the headstones and built the house on top of the graves. If you talk to any of the home workers, they each will have at least one story to tell. In the 2 years I worked in the home, had many experiences. My first experience happened on my very first midnight shift in the home. I was in the office and heard a soft humming coming from the back hallway. Now let me remind you that none of the home's residents are able to get out of bed or walk by themselves. As I crept to the hallway, I saw a lady floating at the end of the hallway. She looked at me, smiled, and disappeared into thin air. I learned that she was a regular sight around the house. She was a good ghost who seemed to keep watch over the residents. In time, she showed up less and less. Eventually, the house seemed to develop a negative energy. In one room, we had a resident turn for the worse very suddenly and eventually die. That resident kept telling us to get the dark man out of his room, and that the dark man wants his room back. The next resident we put into that room quickly developed an infection that no doctor could pinpoint. He spent several weeks in the ICU and eventually lost his spot in the home. He did, however, recover. The resident after him had a stroke. One evening, in another bedroom, In the house, another worker and I heard a growling coming from the closet. Assuming that the cat had gotten shut in there, we opened the door to let him out. There was no cat in there. Upon opening the door, we were greeted with a very large gust of cold air and a low growl. I don't think I have ever run so fast. One morning, an aide was feeding a resident a snack in his room. I heard a scream, and she came running out crying and shaking. Something had yanked her ponytail. She was so upset she had to be sent home. The few residents in the home that could talk also complained about a man in a striped shirt who hid in the closets. One even refused to sleep in her room. One of the nurses was in the above-mentioned bedroom where the ponytail incident took place. She noticed something in the window. She pulled out her phone and snapped a picture. In the picture, you can see a man looking in the window. It was obviously not a real person as he was transparent. The same man could be seen walking past many of the windows of the house and was even seen peeking in the entryway. The entryway is a set of two doors with a small entry room in between them. There is no way it could have been a real person because they are handicapped doors, and when they open you can hear them from almost anywhere in the house, and when the outside door opens, so does the inside door. Little things occurred regularly, such as doors opening and closing, lights turning on and off, random items being moved and found in different locations. These things happen so often that we actually didn't even pay attention to them. It's unfortunate that it is a medical home because it should really be investigated by a professional. That will never get to happen because of patient confidentiality. I do pray for those souls that have been disturbed and hope that someday soon the lady who wandered the halls returns to protect the residents. Next story. It was early spring of 2008. Bo and I decided to buy new camping gear. We were so happy to put winter behind us and look forward to enjoying Mother Nature once again. Bo was anxious to camp, yet the nights were still very chilly, and I remained quite hesitant. But after all of his pleas, I finally gave in. So we set out for Tea Creek Campground for the holiday weekend. Many other eager campers had arrived early and grabbed the good spots, so we made our spot towards the back of the camp close to the bathrooms, which I liked a lot. This was our first time to Tea Creek. We fished, hiked, and settled in for dinner by the fire. Thankfully, our good neighbors donated their extra firewood to our cause as we were not totally ready. After the sun went down, it began to get so cold that we decided to turn in early. We snuggled with one another and with Lucy, our dog. For a while we lay all shivering together. I was just about ready to pack it up and head home when I realized they had fallen sound asleep. How could they? It's freezing. Now it was just me who lay wide awake, alone trying to lull myself to sleep, with the normal crick and crack of the forest. In the distance I could hear other campers, but after a few hours they retired and everything became silent. It must have been some time after 1 a.m. when I heard the horrific screams coming down the road. It was the wildest screaming screech, each followed by a deep lapsing grunt. It also sounded like it was beating its hooves on the ground. It was a deep beating sound hard to explain. I mean to tell you, these sounds are straight out of a horror flick. I've never heard anything of the sort ever, and it was heading in our direction, screaming, 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 at such a frightening pitch, so loud that I couldn't believe Lucy didn't wake up and begin to bark. The thing grew so close that I thought of unzipping the tent to take a look, but I just laid there with my imagination running amok, and no gun, scared. When it got down to our sight, it took a turn into the woods and screamed its way up the hill until it was gone. Needless to say, I did not get to sleep that night, at least not until the sun began to rise. The following morning, I told Bo what I had heard, and he didn't know what to think. I thought I might go around and ask our neighbors, but many had already packed up and left. I did manage to look for tracks, but I'm no tracker. When I got home, I questioned several hunters, researched screaming animals, listened to many bird calls, especially screech owls, and found absolutely nothing. And the result was, Bo could never convince me to return to that campsite. Next story. I was born in Huntington, West Virginia, and grew up in an old wooden two-story house on Auburn Road, located in the Westmoreland district. My family bought that house back in 1928. They had moved there from another house on Auburn Road, one that was located less than a mile away from the other one. Even at a young age, I thought that seemed odd. I remember that the family was always reluctant to even speak about the other house. They would not even look at the old house when we drove past it, and nobody would ever tell me what happened there, or the particulars of what actually prompted the family to relocate. All they would say was that the old house was haunted, and that was all I really needed to know. There were 5 of us living in our house in the early 1960s. My grandmother was the family matriarch. She shared the house with their 3 grown children, one of whom was my divorced mother. The other 2 were my aunt, who had lost her husband in World War II, and my uncle, who was paralyzed with polio from childhood and had never married or moved away. We were a very close family, and for the most part, not unlike other families living in the neighborhood. There were unspoken secrets in my family, secrets that they all took to their graves. And now, as the sole survivor of the family lineage, I wonder if there was any connection between those secrets and the strange events that I have witnessed in that house over the years. I can't help but believe that when my family left their old house, whatever they were attempting to get away from had followed them, and to this day, whatever it was, it is still there. My earliest recollection of strange experiences in our house begins when I was 13 years old. My aunt was helping me clean my room, which was situated on the 2nd floor at the top of an enclosed stairwell. I'd gone downstairs to get a broom and dustpan. Before I could return upstairs, my aunt came down. She appeared shaken and white as a sheet. At the time, she wouldn't say what was wrong except that she was finished with that room. It was my room, and I should be the one that cleaned it, she informed me. It was not until many years later that I learned the full truth. She had been bending over to pick up some clutter, and when she looked up she saw a woman in white, with black hair in the reflection of the mirror. To be honest, in my entire childhood, I never felt comfortable going up and down those stairs. On one occasion, about 11 p.m. one night, I was preparing to go up the stairs. I always kept my eyes down when climbing those steps. It was very dim because the only light in the stairwell was that coming from the upstairs bathroom. I was on the landing, about to start to climb, when I looked up and saw a thick white mist at the top of the stairs. I took off out of there as fast as I could. My grandmother said it was a reflection or something, that I didn't really see anything. Regardless, I never slept in that upstairs room again. In fact, for most of my teenage years, I didn't sleep much at all. Most of the night, I would just lay in bed listening to noises inside the walls. In the late 60s, I married and moved out of the old house, although from time to time we would visit and spend the night there. My 2 sons spent a great deal of time at that house, especially on weekends visiting with their grandmother. Even my sons had creepy experiences in the house. Although they kept this between themselves in their younger years, it seems that both of them were in agreement that a certain back room in the house was spooky, and they stayed away from it. In fact, no matter how much the room was changed or rearranged over the years, nobody wanted to go there after dark. My husband even refused to sleep in that bedroom on numerous occasions, opting instead to sleep on a couch in the front room. He said he just did not like the feel of the room. That particular room was adjacent to the kitchen, and it seems that when anyone was in the kitchen, they insisted on keeping the connecting door shut. In later years, even as grown men, my sons have seen strange black shadows in the hallway near the bedroom door. My husband had seen them as well. In the mid-80s, my husband took a job with the Voice of America and was recruited into the U.S. Foreign Service. Over the past 20 plus years, we have mostly lived overseas in places like Central America, Europe, Africa, and the Middle East, but we always try to come home for Christmas and spend the holidays at my old home. On most occasions, the sleeping arrangements on these return visits have been less than desirable, depending on who was still living in the house and how things had been rearranged. One year, the double bed that had normally been in the front guest bedroom had been replaced by a smaller single bed that couldn't accommodate 2 people. So I gave my husband the guest room bed and I took the living room sofa. That big green sofa had been a fixture in the house since my childhood and was very familiar and comfortable. I remember snuggling down under the cover of a warm comforter, ready for a good night's sleep. We had just flown into town and had spent most of that day running around visiting. After 20 hours of traveling on planes and a full day of visiting the children and their families, I would have thought that sleep would come easy, but it didn't. I found myself having a very difficult time getting to sleep, and then I heard it. I heard the distinct sound of footsteps descending the staircase on the other side of the wall behind the sofa. My first thought was that my aunt could not sleep either, and that she was coming downstairs, so I waited for her to open the door and come into the living room, but no one came in. The very next night I once again heard footsteps descending the staircase, and once again no one came into the living room. On the third night, when this happened again, I got up and decided to check it out. I opened the door expecting to see my aunt, but no one was there. I walked back and looked up those old familiar stairs. There were no lights on, so I climbed the stairs and found my aunt sound asleep in her bed. I went back downstairs rather confused and more than a bit unnerved. The following night I once again heard the same heavy-footed person descending the steps one by one. I lay there and listened. Then, unlike the previous nights, I heard the creak of the door opening. I was scared and lay there just waiting for something to happen, but nothing did. There was no sound of the door closing again or of anyone walking, just an eerie silence. When I finally summoned up enough courage to take my head out from under the comforter, I looked around. There was nobody. Then I got up and noticed immediately that the door was open. I quickly shut the door and returned to the safety of my comfortable nest on the old sofa. I covered my head and wished for sleep. The nights that followed, every single night, the same pattern of behavior repeated. The heavy footsteps, the creaking door, and then the deafening sound of total silence. And each night I was becoming more and more unnerved by these nightly visits. Now, every night I found myself lying awake in the dark, waiting for the now familiar footfalls as my invisible visitor approached and opened the living room door opening. And it was not until this nightly one-act play concluded that I could finally relax and go to sleep. I will never forget the last night of this performance, because on that night, to my horror and astonishment, there was an act 2. As on the many previous nights, I lay on the couch waiting for things to begin. Soon I heard the all too familiar sounds of the heavy footsteps descending the wooden stairs. Then, as I listened for the door to creak open, I was suddenly aware that something was different this night. As I huddled under the covers, I sensed a strange presence standing over me. Then I felt the pressure of a hand on my shoulder. My heart was pounding. I'm not sure that I was even breathing, and I was too scared to pull down the cover and look. I lay there terrified for what seemed like an eternity, and then my fear turned to anger. And without moving, I summoned up my determination and said, "Go away and leave me alone." And the weight of the hand suddenly vanished. What, or whoever it was gone. The next thing I remember, it was the next morning. I told my husband about it, and he said that I should have asked it what it wanted. I told him I really wasn't interested in what it wanted, but I would consider doing so if it came back. I would like to say that was the end of things, but it wasn't. That night and every night for the rest of our visit, it came down the stairs again, but it no longer opened the door and no hand reached out. It was keeping its distance. In later years, there are some strange things that happened in that old house. Some may write it off as an overactive imagination, but I don't. There were 2 occasions when I was the only one in the house. I heard my mother call me. Then the second time I heard my aunt calling my name. Both of them were long deceased when this happened, and it happened in the middle of the day. A few years ago, my aunt passed away. She was the last surviving sibling of my grandmother's family. In her last days, she opened up to me and told me more detailed accounts of her experience. She told me about 3 ghosts she had seen upstairs. The lady in white, when I was a kid, a man dressed in 40s clothing with a black mustache, and a little girl that wore a green plaid dress that she saw sitting on her bed. But neither of us could link these apparitions with the footsteps in the stairwell, and the footsteps were not always confined to the staircase. One Christmas, when my 3-year-old granddaughter was spending the night with me, there was another incident. Everyone else in the house was asleep. We were in the bed in the front guest room, and my husband was asleep in the living room on the old sofa. We heard the front door open, and someone, very heavy-footed, walked through the room. I thought I was the only one that heard it, but then my granddaughter rolled over and said, "Tell Grandpa to quit being so noisy." Well, I bolted up out of the bed and opened the door. Grandpa was sound asleep. That was the last night my granddaughter ever stayed all night. I always told myself that when my family passed away and I inherited that old house, that I would sell it and never look back. But when my aunt passed away, I found I could not bring myself to sell the house. I was raised in that house, and my sons practically grew up in it. So, with the full agreement of my sons and husband, we decided to keep it and embarked on a 10-year plan to completely remodel the house. And since my husband still works overseas, we continued to come back every Christmas while our sons worked on the renovations. The sleeping arrangements are still somewhat difficult because we are now sleeping in an ongoing construction zone, but a sense of peace now rests in the house that has never been there before, or so we thought. The first few years into the work, there were no other strange occurrences. Naturally, we felt that with all the remodeling work and tearing out things, that whoever was there had finally left. The creepy back bedroom wall was removed and combined with another room to make a large dining room. The downstairs floor plan had been completely changed, and a new staircase to upstairs had been built in the front living room. And with the exception of my son's reporting the strong smell of my late aunt's perfume wafting through the air from time to time, things have been very quiet, until recently. After the new staircase was built towards the front of the house, the old stairwell was slated to be removed and the space turned into a storage closet. And with the start of that work, it seems that the apparitions may have returned. Very recently, my 40-plus age oldest son told me that he is beginning to sense something upstairs. A friend who has been helping them recently was startled when he saw a dark shadow move across the old hallway. So I guess that whatever was there is still there. It has only been dormant, and it was not until work began to close off the old stairwell that they decided to make their presence known. To my knowledge, nothing ever happened to anyone who had lived in this house before my family bought it in 1928. It was built in 1922 and was relatively new when my family bought it. The family that sold the house to my family just moved on. There is nothing known about them. So what is the presence that remains in the house? And why does it seem to be inextricably tied to that old staircase? Perhaps the next time I feel that hand, I will ask.